to me, there's no greater story than a story of people who are in bondage, who yearn to break free and break free, and they do. And that, to me, those are the stories that I want to tell.
You're listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author Sarah Box. We focus on the mantra, no labels, no limits, no excuses. And now, without further ado, please welcome your commanding coach with plenty of chutzpah and heart, Sarah Box.
Hey there, No Labels, No Limits podcast listeners. This is Sarah Box, your host, and we are back for another week of the podcast. And this week is going to be a little different. You know, each week we try to share stories of folks who have overcome challenges to accomplish really difficult things and change the course of their own life and the lives of others, as well as inspire people to reach beyond what they perceive as their limitations. Today, we're going to do that on two levels. I'm going to be speaking with Mark Sullivan, who is a distinguished journalist and award-winning author of 20 novels. And you're going to recognize the three most recent, hopefully, because his New York #1 New York best-selling author, Beneath a Scarlet Sky, was my introduction to his writing of this type of work, and it changed me. And I'm currently reading The Last Green Valley, and he has another one that just came out in May of this year, 2024, All the Glimmering Stars. So they're similar in some respects in terms of the impact they can have, but they're very different stories of very real people. Mark, his works have, you know, you've been recognized in New York Times, notable books, all of that, and you have a history, you know, like we all come from histories. You're a graduate, you've got your degrees, Hamilton College, Northwestern, Medill School of Journalism, Peace Corps, and you are an avid skier and adventurer, and you live in one of the most beautiful places in our country, Bozeman, Montana, with your wife and family. So with that, Mark, I want to welcome you to the No Labels, No Limits podcast and say how much I'm glad that you had time to connect with us here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I just listed 3 books. Now, what I didn't say is you've been writing books with James Patterson, so you've got a long list of those books as well. I didn't go into those because it's a different type of book, which also I'm an avid reader of. But I mentioned to you before I hit record that I was recommended via a friend to read Beneath the Scarlet Sky. And when I just read like what it's about, I thought, well, I don't know if I'm going to even resonate with that book. But I respect this guy, so I read the book, and it changed me. It really changed how I thought about things. There were places in the book that I just had to stop and just sit with it, you know, for a while. So let's talk a little bit. I'm going to ask you to talk over the course of our interview a little bit about people. So starting with Pino, I know you've told this story many times, but how did you first hear about Pino and decide to?
So in February of 2006, I was kind of at the lowest point in my life. I published a book that I loved, and it tanked in the United States. My little brother, who was my best friend, had drunk himself to death, and my wife and I were in this long, lingering business dispute that had us teetering on the edge of personal bankruptcy. And I realized while driving to Costco, of all places, on a snowy Saturday afternoon, that because of insurance, I was worth more dead than alive. And I considered driving into a bridge abutment on I-90 because, you know, snowing out, horrible conditions, no one would have suspected that I did it on purpose. I didn't do it. I love my wife, I love my kids, I love my nephew, and all these people were playing in my mind when I got to the Costco parking lot and put my head on the steering wheel and begged the universe, whatever you want, to help me. I needed a story. I needed a story that mattered. That's what I wanted. And, you know, I go in, I go do the shopping at Costco, I go home. My wife had no idea that I'd reached this, you know, crisis. And she says, you have to go to a dinner party at the Robinsons, these friends of ours. And I said, I'm not going to any dinner party. She said, you have to. We've canceled on them like 3 times. She said, just go. I'm not feeling well, but you just go. If you're not feeling it after an hour, leave. So I go, And I sit down at this dinner table across from a total stranger, and he starts telling me about Pinot Noir. And I was like, nah, we would have heard of this guy, a 17-year-old boy who leads Jews escaping Nazi-occupied Italy over the top of the Alps and into Switzerland, and then through a series of remarkable circumstances becomes this driver to this super powerful general in Italy, and in effect becomes a spy inside the German High Command. And I said, no. And he said, well, I think he's alive. I go, well, how old is he? He was 78, 79. And it's like, okay. And I go home. My wife's like, what happened to you? And I said, well, I don't know. But if this plays out, I think I'm taking the last of our money and going to Italy to chase a 60-year-old war story. And my wife, being my wife, being married to me for, probably 28 years at that point, says, well, of course you are. And I did. 6 weeks later, I got off a plane and I met Pinot Noir and spent 3 weeks with him trying to, resurrect this story out of time and his memory and how it worked and the places he went. And as I opened up to him and he opened up to me, I had a different perspective on life, really, when I left. His perspective on grief and personal tragedy in our life and the ups and downs, it just put me in a different perspective. And I left Italy after that first 3 weeks pretty much a changed person. And I was vowing that I would tell the story to as many people as I could. And then it became this crazy idea that I would tell the story to 1 billion people. And that got me excited enough to drive it through almost 10 years of work. I wasn't a historical novelist when I started. I was a pretty good researcher. I had done some archival research. I don't speak Italian. I don't speak German. I had to assemble these teams to help me. It took a long time. And about 5 years into it, I was frustrated because I could see holes in the story, that I wasn't able, Pinot didn't know, he wasn't able to, and I wasn't able to put it together from other historical perspectives. And I ran into this woman who, not my agent, but an agent I had known for years from very early in my career. And she asked me what I was up to, and I told her about this story and how I was trying to write it as pure nonfiction, and it wasn't working. And she said, well, Mark, if that story had come to you 20 years ago when you were a journalist, I would have said, tough luck. But that story came to you when you were a novelist, and a really good one. And she said, I think you should tell it as a novel, because a novel can do something that most nonfiction, I'm not saying all nonfiction, but most nonfiction can't do, which is to bring the story to life so that the reader experiences what happened in effect to Pinot Noir. That's what I was after. And I was after that. I wanted the story to have the same impact on readers as it had on me, So that became the North Star. How am I telling the story so it has the maximum impact on readers? And I found the way to do that was to use the arc of Pinot Noir's emotional story as my guide. At one point, the book was like 800 pages long because it had different perspectives, including Father Barbareschi was a forger and had this whole other escape route. And I knew all about it and described it, but it had to come out at a certain point. No one was going to read something that huge. So I just decided if Pinot Noir hadn't seen it or had heard of it, it didn't happen, at least in my book. It could be referenced to, but it didn't happen, live in the book.
So Pinot is really young when this begins with him.
17 is when he's just turned 17 when we meet him.
And his whole life in just an instant is turned, it's upheaval. It's like the curtain opens and he's thrust in the middle of this, but he makes a choice.
He makes a choice. He answers to his own inner voice, and he makes a choice time and again to do things that are, in effect, not in his best interest. They're altruistic. He's doing them for the sake of other people, like leading Jews over the Alps in snowstorms and, very difficult climbing routes, etc.
Now, when you were researching, did you go over any of that, or did you drive and see what he did? Because I know that you're avid outdoorsman.
Yeah, I was lucky that I went in kind of early April, I guess I went, 2006, and I rented skis at the ski area, now a ski area where the boys' school was and everything. And Casa Alpina is there, but it's a hotel. It's not the boys' camp or school. And I was able to ski into a lot of the routes by traversing across. For example, I could see the hard way in very close, and I got to the top of it, and I was able to look over the top to see, right down the chute to see what they came up. And I was like, wow, I'm a pretty experienced climber and mountaineer, and I don't know if I'd want to do that in street shoes at night, that kind of thing.
Well, knowing that you could be killed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Having driven over the other direction, the Swiss Alps into Italy, you just look and you're thinking, oh my God, this is like impassable. And there's roads there now, so, so when you met with him and you're gone this time, I know you had to come back and do extra research to fill in the blanks. How did that, how did you manage that, I guess, into like your life? Because it took you a long time to do the research. You hit a 5-point kind of frustration lull. How did you keep your own momentum and motivation during that?
I was working on the story, and every time my enthusiasm would flag, I'd go back to the basic premise of it, and I was like, come on, buddy, this is too good to give up on. And so I did go back, and each time I went back, I learned a little more, and that gave me, a greater and greater focus. But to be honest, I was being a novelist. I was doing novelistic things to the story where there were gaps in the story. So, for example, I couldn't have told the story of 30 escapes, right, which Pinault said roughly he led. So I had to make a decision, and, the nonfiction writer would have described all these different escapes and yada, 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 and you wouldn't have had the experience. And I unabashedly crammed them together into 2. The best parts of all the escapes got put into 2. And so the reader gets the truth of the experience because all these things happen to Pinoella, but now they're told in a way that's fictional. I string them together so you have that experience of the climbs, in real time, in a sense.
Did you have to do that when he was driving for the general, like compress a lot of stuff there, or how much of that was more linear, I guess?
Well, a lot more of it was linear, that's for certain, because, he picks him up at a certain time and he's there all the way forward until the end. So there was some of that. There were things that I knew about the general, but again, Pinault didn't. Like, supposedly he had helped a Jewish conductor in Venice escape. That was, I'd seen that, but Pinault didn't know. It was referenced to in the 800-page book, but didn't go. There was evidence that the general, for example, when he was told to kill prisoners, instead did a swap of prisoners, and Pinoella did not remember that, so I didn't put it in. But there were other things about him that I knew that just didn't make it because of this filter. Was Pinault there? Did he remember it? Was it, can I corroborate it in another way? So in effect, I'm still telling fiction because I'm leaving stuff out that may or may not have happened, but my guy didn't know, so it didn't go in. And that was my own filter, and you can take fault with it or not, but that's the way I did it. So.
Well, I can't find any fault with it because it kept me in the story.
Yeah, right.
It's just total nonfiction. It might be, okay, I'll get back to this later. versus
Right.
going, okay, now where are we? What's going on here? And I mean, it isn't just for, if you haven't read the book, and if I really think it's time to read it now, I feel it's super germane today as it has been. But, it isn't just him, it's his family, what happens to I mean, there's just all of this interplay of how the courage basically across the board of everybody, and the faith, that some people just went on pure faith. And like you said, altruistic behavior, all of hiding the radio, all that stuff. So, so when you finished this book, Scarlet Sky, you talked about being different when you came back. Did people recognize the difference in you?
Oh yeah. People recognized it. They saw it. I stopped from being this kind of dark, brooding individual to a person who was looking around at life as like, hey, this is kind of a miracle. That as bad as it gets, it's still a miracle. And you can't lose sight of that. And that put me on a different path, a way of thinking and stuff. One thing led to another. I ended up being in India studying with monks, and that changed me even more. Yeah. But it all started with him.
It's one of those things, it's kind of like a click in time if you've not gone to that dinner party, or even if you hadn't had your head on the steering wheel and asked for help, right?
Right.
Where would you be today? So let's jump forward in time, and let's talk about Anthony and I forget, Florence. Anthony, yeah. Florence. So this is a very different story. And can you tell our listeners, so I want you to switch out of World War II, listeners, and you're coming present day, relatively present day, into a whole different conflict, and still very young, heroic people.
So I'll kind of just bridge it.
Sure.
After I finished Beneath the Scarlet Sky, everybody was saying, oh, you'll never find a story like that again. It's a once in a lifetimer. And I was like, nah, I think, because I had to change as a writer, right? I had done all this stuff on my own with mystery and suspense novels, and with James Patterson, who I'm blessed to, still work with behind the scenes. And that's a mental game. That's very much intellectual. I'm trying to create a puzzle. I, take you on an adventure whatsoever, whatever. But this kind of story, Beneath the Scarlet Sky, required me to write from my heart. That's what I was trying to get at on these arcs of the emotion. I had to open myself up in a way that I hadn't before, and a writer to write about that. So anyway, people said, you'll never find another story like that. And I was like, no, I think I probably will. And sure enough, about 7 months after that, I had a guy come up to me and say, at a talk I was giving in Bozeman about the book, and he said, when I was, do you know these people in town, the Martells? And I said, well, I know who they are, but I don't know them. And he said, the entire time I was reading Beneath the Scarlet Sky, all I could think of was the story of how they came to America. And he said, you need to hear it. 3 days later, I get this call. Next day, I'm going, and the guy lives like 2 miles from my house, and I've turned into this little old neighborhood, and I get this weird feeling. And it's not until I pull into Bill Martell's driveway that I realize that I can't be 250 yards from where I heard Beneath the Scarlet Sky. I can't. It's the same neighborhood. And I go in, and I'm listening, and within an hour, it's meeting all my criteria, which I was getting a lot of ideas, between the time Beneath was published and beneath the time I found The Last Green Valley. And I had to have some kind of criteria. What was I looking for? And I analyzed Beneath, and I said, the reason that story resonated so well with people is it's inherently moving, inspiring, healing to some people, and actually transformative to others. And so those were the 4 words. And within an hour of talking to Bill Martell, I was getting all 4 words in a big way. And so I spent 3 years working on that story, and going to Ukraine prior to the invasion, and being there and telling what's in effect a refugee story, and publishing it right as Putin invades and a whole other refugee story happens. So people said, oh, you'll never find another book like that. And I said, no, I think I will. And it wasn't until the spring of 2019, and a very close friend of our family's died. My sons were very good skiers and tried to make the U.S. ski team, and they lived in Salt Lake City with this guy, Alan Hayes, who, among other things, invented the computer mouse. And Alan was a great guy, and he served as a host dad for these boys trying to make the U.S. ski team. He had done it all the way back to Tommy Moe, the downhiller. And my kids were very close to Alan. Each of them lived with him close to 5 years, and he became a tight member of our family. And he died like out of the blue after a spinal surgery. He had some kind of clot and died. And my kids were really shaken up. And it was like all the boys, like 29, 30 boys from going back, 15, 18 years, they all converged in Salt Lake. And it turned out that my oldest son, Connor, was one of Alan's executors, along with an architect from Seattle and a guy who was the squadron commander of SEAL Team 6. He had gone to school in Salt Lake City and then entered Annapolis and became a SEAL. And he told this story to Connor one night of these two 14-year-old kids, boy and girl, in Uganda, northern Uganda, in the early 1990s. And they get kidnapped at 14 by this warlord, Joseph Kony. And Anthony eventually becomes Kony's radio man. And Kony has raised an army largely through kidnapping of children. He has adults in the army, but his soldiers are kids. So he goes all over kidnapping kids, and we're talking like close to 30,000+ kids over the course of his reign of terror. And so anyway, I heard the story and I was blown away, especially when they said, if this was told right, we think it could end child soldiering forever. And I'm getting this from not only Eric Ulrich, the SEAL, but another guy, Mick Mulroy, who at the time was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under General Mattis. And he had been the CIA station chief in Kampala, and he was the first one to hear the story. And when they both told it to me, I was like, all right, I'm in, let's go. We couldn't get there in June of 20, which is when we were trying because of the pandemic. So we got delayed a year. Finally got there in June of 19. We meant to spend 3 to 4 weeks. We got to spend about 15 days because the Delta variant was raising its head and they were going to close Uganda. So we got out by the skin of our teeth after 15 days, but we had it. I spent the whole 15 days with Anthony and Florence. A lot of time with Florence because Mick and Eric had heard all of Anthony's story, but very little of Florence's story. And I was lucky that I had a great, Anthony speaks great English. Florence understands English, but doesn't speak it very well. So we brought in an Acholi translator who luckily was also an expert on child soldiering. Wow. So I was able to, through her, ask all sorts of questions. And over the course of the 2 weeks, I got Florence to trust me that I wasn't there to exploit her. And I was going to get her to open up. And she finally did. And her story is just flat out unbelievable. And it really offered just such a remarkable counterpoint to what Anthony was going through as effectively an insider inside the high command of the Lord's Resistance Army, as Kony's radio man, hearing everything, seeing everything, relaying his orders. And the thing that really amazed me was the people that they were when I got there. So I've met enough of these people now who have gone through these tremendous hardships, who have, endured things like running from the Soviet Union under the protection of the Nazis in a Conestoga wagon in the last Green Valley, or Pino Lella trying to come of age in this tumultuous final 18 months of World War II. And then, of course, Anthony and Florence, and all these people, when you meet them, you would figure that they would be destroyed individuals. And it's quite the opposite. They glow. They have been through the worst that humanity and life can throw at them, and they've emerged on the other side to see the beauty and the miraculousness of it. And Anthony and Florence, they think of their life as an absolute miracle. They can't believe it, that they survived, that they turned the tables on Coney, that Anthony testified against him and his henchmen in The Hague, and that, their story is being heard around the world.
Has that had the type of reception that you'd hoped? I know it hasn't been out as long, but what kind of...
No. It's too bad, because I think it's without a doubt my best book.
Why do you suppose that is, Mark?
It's tough because, they're kids, they're 14-year-old kids, and they're forced to do stuff. But everything that happens in that book happened. They describe stuff in depth, and I had to do novelistic things to it because, for example, there were 5 characters with the same exact name. That was not going to work. I don't care how skilled you are. There's no way that's going to work. So they became one person, and that composite was a smart move on my part, because otherwise the book would have been just out of control and incomprehensible. It's a tough book. It doesn't take place in Europe in World War II. It takes place in Africa in the 90s. But, when I heard the story, I recognized that the big parts of it were dark, what they had to go through. But again, having met them and heard how they came out of it, it was one of the most inspirational things I've ever listened to. It was just, it filled me with joy to be able to do the book for them. And so, I've come to understand as a novelist, as an artist, if I can call myself that, or an author or writer, you get paid a lot, right? You get paid by the publishing company, you get paid by royalties, but you also get paid by the people who write you letters and say, I was changed by the story of Anthony and Florence. I will never bitch about my life again. And the crazy thing is that teenagers have embraced the book. It's a finalist for the Teen Readers Award, which takes place in February. And there are 3 finalists, and it's there. And it came totally organically. This was nothing that I did. It's just that teenagers have embraced the story.
Well, when you think about it, and I thought about it in terms of like both those young folks and they're young. And if I were young and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is what's possible when things are tough. Look at what these guys went through, what I can take from it. It makes perfect sense to me that it would be popular there. And I'm just curious, because I think the story's powerful. And if you'll talk a little bit about the whole psychological piece of it, because I think we tend to distance ourselves from how easily it is to manipulate, especially before your minds are formed.
That's right.
Folks, and it still goes on.
Yeah. So Coney was a very smart guy. He understood human nature, and he purposefully tried to get boys between the ages of like 11 and 16, 17. That was his wheelhouse of who he wanted as his soldiers. And it was because he knew that their brains weren't fully formed, that their frontal lobe, which is sort of the center of wisdom and discretion and all these kind of things. And he knew if he could imprint his, mad philosophy on them and turn them into fearless warriors, he really had an army on his hand. And so he used all these techniques to break them down and build them up. And I remember when I first heard that story from the SEAL and the spy, and the SEAL told me, when I heard what he went through in training, Anthony, he said, I said, half the guys I knew who were SEAL team members would have washed out. They would not have survived it. They would have given up because it was just so rugged. And yet Anthony's will to live, largely fueled by his childhood. His parents, this is what I found fascinating. Both Anthony and Florence's parents really taught them a lot of things about life at a young age. Anthony's father teaches Anthony not only to navigate by the stars, hence the title, All the Glimmering Stars, but he also teaches him what it is to be a good human. And Florence's mother believes that there's nothing more powerful in the universe than the power of love. And the fascinating thing is that they were taught these things from a perspective of unconditional love. That was the environment they were raised in, an environment of unconditional love where they were granted certain value or taught certain values, principles, way to live their life. And because of that love, it being so strong, it anchored in their heart. And they never forgot it. We're talking a 10-year ordeal that they went through. They never forgot it. And they will absolutely tell you that they were saved by the power of love. Yeah.
So let's step back into present day, what's going on, craziness with, whether it's child labor, which is, it's not as tough as what those guys are going. Well, it could be, we don't know because it's hidden. But really, that's one of the reasons I wondered how come it might have had. It's like, we just don't want to recognize that happens. And so now knowing what you know, I would imagine you want your book to have impact, which it sounds like it's having. It's gaining traction maybe a little more organically than others might. But for adult readers, older readers who are reading it, what would you hope they would take from it and maybe even think differently or act differently as a result of it?
I don't write like Aesop's fairy tales or whatever. I don't mean to deliver a straight message, because it just should be apparent to whoever reads it, and everyone takes a little bit away from it. But with Anthony and Florence is the human spirit can be indomitable. It can overcome stuff that is just unfathomable. Time and again, it'll do this. And that's what I hope people come away from it by, hearing the story of these two 14-year-olds, from remote villages in northern Uganda, who go on to have effectively a story of humanity, right? To me, there's no greater story than a story of people who are in bondage, who yearn to break free, and they do. And that, to me, those are the stories that I want to tell. They're not edgy, they're not mystery and suspense novels. And look, I love every novel that I've ever written like that. But these are different. These are stories that I think people need to hear. We've gotten away from them and sort of view the world very cynically and nihilistically. And these kind of stories remind us that the human spirit is still incredibly powerful, especially if it marches in lockstep with love.
So as we're going into a new year, 2025, depending on when people are listening to this, are you looking for another story? You still have another, you have one kind of, you're working with?
I found one. It took me about a year and a half, and I thought I had one that was based in Vietnam, which I was excited about, but the guy that it happened to, he just decided he didn't want his words, the notoriety. And I was like, okay, there's nothing I can do about it. So, and then I just sort of went into semi-retirement waiting. I figured the story would find me. And all of a sudden I got this email from these people I'd heard from after Beneath was published. And they wanted me to tell the story, but there's two characters in the story, and one of the characters' wives was still alive. And because of the nature of the story, she didn't want the story told while she was alive. Well, in late July this year, I got an email from the family saying she died. And did I still want to do the story? And I did. It was that kind of story. And so it's the story about a brother and a sister in World War II, and they become two of the greatest aviators in history, and no one's ever heard of them.
So when do we get that story?
Oh, I'm just started. So wait, about 2 to 3 years. It takes me a while to do this stuff.
I would imagine with the research and the writing.
Yeah.
But that's just what happens. You get, it's like, okay, I want to know more. Tell us more.
Yeah.
So more. So I want to shift gears for just a second. You know, you've mentioned briefly today, but in other interviews, I've heard you mention this too about your wife just saying, okay, of course you're going to go, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, you've been married a long time.
40 years.
Yeah. Congrats.
Thank
I
you.
strive for that. I expect to get there, but I still strive for it. What have you noticed? I mean, like, I'm just thinking about the intensity of your work, being gone, doing these really in-depth heart. When you start working from the heart, it changes you. I'm just wondering how you would reflect on how to navigate that successfully for other folks, or what you've learned along the way about keeping your best pal in your marriage.
Yeah, well, a lot of this had to do, you know, our marriage has been strong. Luckily, from the moment we met, we were just mad about each other, and we still are. You know, we're a partnership. She carried me through years when I wasn't making any money as a novelist. Betsy is always there to give me support. She's a big reader. She doesn't read editorially. She just reads, and she's always one of my first readers. So is my son, Connor, who's a very good novelist himself. The big thing we learned was that when she was running her own business and I was really starting to take off as a novelist, working with Patterson, et cetera, and just writing around the clock, we were getting our energies mixed up. She was coming home from work in a very masculine energy, having written, you know, guided, managed her practice all day. And being a novelist is a feminine pursuit. It's, you know, you have to have all sorts of feminine characteristics, like the ability to focus on more than one sense at once. This is very difficult for men to do, but women do it with ease. And I had to teach myself how to do that. Well, we were coming back into our lives sort of, you know, at odds, and it didn't work well. And a friend, we were lucky that we've gotten to know this guy, Tony Robbins, and one day I asked him, and he said, oh, that's pretty easy. Just tell Betsy to go home and change into something that makes her feel feminine, and you go in after work and pump weights for a little while. It'll work. And it did.
He's so wise.
He's wise.
And simple.
Very simple. And, you know, it's nice that he also, you know, taught me that, or, you know, other people taught me as well, is that, you know, I'm here in my office, which is in a separate building on my property. When I leave here, I don't think about the book. I've learned to divorce myself through it. I have other stuff to do, but it's not book writing. And book writing takes place in here, or I have 2 other offices in the state that I go to, because no one cares where I work, so I move around.
Yeah. Well, so you get to compartmentalize your writing person.
Yes.
From your other person.
It's a persona. It's different. It's not, you know, it's me, but it's not the me I carry into the rest of my life.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really wise. Well, I'm going to let you take us out of the podcast, if you would. I would like for you to leave us. Well, first of all, I want to ask you, is there a question you wished I'd asked you that you're going, dang it, I wish we'd talked about?
Sure. How does the way you write differ from when you were younger, right? I used to just force it. So long story short is I go to India about 6 years ago, and I was on a spiritual retreat. And I started working with these monks, female monks, by the way. And one of them asked me one day, so Mark, how'd you get involved in writing? And I give the same answer I give to everybody. It's, you know, a 6 foot, 200-pound penguin. And her name was Sister Mary Joseph. She was the vice principal and disciplinarian at St. Anne's Parochial School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I lived in 2nd grade. And I got in a fist fight with another kid. I can't remember about what, but all of a sudden I was hauled up into the air by my collar, and there's Sister Mary Joseph, and she was a disciplinarian. She could whack you with a 3-sided ruler, and I expected that was coming. And instead she said, Mark Sullivan, your punishment is you are going to go home and write a short story and enter it in the grades 1 through 8 short story writing contest. And I went, I'm not getting hit. This is really good. So I go home, I find out why it's punishment, right? Because I faced writer's block. I have no idea how to do it, what to do. And, same kind of thing. I was like, oh, I have no idea. And then all of a sudden this rabbit goes racing through our backyard with the neighbor's beagle chasing it. And I go into a cornfield across the street, and I can hear the beagle baying and everything. And so I write about that. And 2 weeks later, I turn it in. 2 weeks later, my parents get called into the principal's office, and they slide the paper across and say, which one of you wrote it? And my parents are like, we've never seen this before. What is it? They said, it's a winner, right? And all well and good. And so that starts me. And I had a lot of other people who supported me in this idea, right, over the year, teachers, et cetera, who would tell me I could be a professional writer if I worked at it. So the monks asked, well, what's it like for you to go to work now? How have you done this? Well, I said, I'm very disciplined. I go in, I have a quota, I have to meet this many pages, and I'm tough with myself. I don't leave until it's done. And so they were asking me even more, like, what happens when you leave your house? How do you go down the little sidewalk to the place? And I said, well, it's like I'm going into a football game or a lacrosse game in college. It's that kind of thing. I'm getting pumped up to do something. And finally, one of them said, do you like writing, Mark? And I went, well, I'm good at it. Let's put it that way. And that gives me a lot of satisfaction. They said, uh-huh. And then they said, you don't see it, do you? And I went, like, see what? And I said, Mark, we believe since second grade, you have been treating writing as a form of punishment. Whoa.
Oh, my God.
Whoa. You mean like I've been intentionally punishing myself for decades, right? Not a good thing. So I go, that happened at the end of the session. So I call my wife from India. I said, I'm done. I'm out of here. I'm not writing. I'm not doing anything. I don't have to. And you have to write. This is all you've ever wanted to do. And I said, not really. I just learned it was not really. So I go back in the next day, and the lady monks are there, and they say, how you doing? I go, not too good. Not too good. I just found out that I've been, engaging in sort of a self-flagellation for 4 decades, and I'm not going to write anymore. And they started laughing at me, these monks. And it's like female monks laughing at a guy who's basically an alpha dude, right? It's not good. And they're like, no, Mark. What if you could learn to not write from a place of punishment, but from a place of joy? And I went, is that possible? And they said, it is. We believe that this myth of suffering artists is just that. It's a myth. And that no artist produced anything good when they were in, full suffering. It was afterwards when they expressed that suffering artistically that it came out. And they did. They taught me how to do that. And actually, probably 90% of All the Glimmering Stars was written from a position of joy. It's not a joyful story until the end. But when I was writing it, I was in a state of joy because I was given this gift as a child. I developed it, and now I have the joy of giving this gift to readers.
Well, I'm glad you added that to the podcast. So give us one thing beyond that you want us to remember as we leave 2024 and head into 2025.
All things change, all things pass. The only continuity you have is in here. So stay there, and you can survive anything.
Okay, listeners, that is it for this week. We will be back next week with another podcast. Mark, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
You bet.
You've been listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author, change agent, and strategic business coach, Sarah Box. You can grab the show notes and find out how to work with Sarah at sarahbox.com/no labels, no limits podcast. We'd love this podcast to reach as many people as possible. Please remember to rate, leave a 5-star review, and share the podcast with someone you think would get value from this conversation. Till next time, keep taking those daily action steps to align your purpose to your principles and achieve your goals in business and life.